Welcome. My name is Gerbert Wierda, and this video contains the presentation about enterprise architecture that I have been giving for the last couple of years. I've done this as a 45-minute presentation at various conferences such as the Gartner Enterprise Architecture Summit. And I've done this as a 3-hour guest lecture at the university with all the juicy anecdotes. Don't worry, this is not the 3-hour version. Normally, if time permits, I will show the why enterprise architecture animation here. You can see that separately on my YouTube channel. We created that animation to explain to all the non-architects in our organization why enterprise architecture is necessary. The animation has been pretty successful. It is now the number 2 popular video if you search for enterprise architecture on YouTube. Let's start. I will be addressing 3 subjects. First, what enterprise architecture is and why it is often so unsuccessful. Then, how enterprise architecture can work. This is not just an idea, by the way. It has been field tested in my own practice. And finally, I will pay special attention to the idea of a future state architecture. Now, if you are an experienced architect, my apologies for addressing some of the basics, as much will not be new for you. For those that are relatively new to enterprise architecture, however, it helps to set the stage for the actual message. And besides, we architects are often in so much disagreement about what our trade is about, it prevents misunderstanding if I make my starting point clear. So, what is enterprise architecture? Let's start with the most fundamental question. Who needs enterprise architecture in the first place? I have worked for several organizations that needed enterprise architecture, but I can easily give you an example of one that does not need it: your local shoe repair shop. There is a single computer annex cash register where transactions are administered, and there probably is some sort of small accounting system. There may be a website hosted somewhere, but it's a small and simple operation, so it doesn't need enterprise architecture. It is also not purely a matter of size. I have worked as lead enterprise architect for APG Asset Management, which has around 600 employees. But it manages over 400 billion euro these days. And it has one of the most complex business IT landscapes I've been confronted with. 400 billion euro means that it invests in all sorts of difficult and complex assets, and it has the complex processes and IT to match. But at one time I visited another 500-man enterprise. They made huge ship screws. Very impressive. But as a subject it was huge, it was not complex. Their IT could be managed by a few techs. In other words, enterprise architecture is about managing complexity. It is also about managing the unpredictability that throws many spanners in the works, but we'll get to that later. So, why enterprise architecture? Well, it all starts with the problem of complexity of some business and their IT landscapes. This was the original reason enterprise architecture was invented somewhere in the 80s of the previous century, some 3 decades ago. This happened when the already complex system architectures started to get connected to each other by computer networks. This turned an already rather complex problem into a hugely complex problem of having many of these systems become dependent on each other. Chaos was the result, and this had to be addressed. The first enterprise architects quickly added 2 more issues they wanted to address. The first is that business became ever more dependent on IT, and they often had an IT landscape that was not fit for changed business goals. IT was in fact holding them back. IT was not aligned with the business. Incidentally, this second goal was by many also seen as a solution for the first goal. After all, by letting the different IT projects all follow the same business strategy, the different IT systems should become more coherent automatically, right? This goal was labeled business IT alignment, and for a long time it was the focus of enterprise architecture initiatives in the world, and the subject of many talks on many conferences. A logical third goal was added soon after. This was the goal that businesses should profit from all the new possibilities that IT offered. If the previous goal is business IT alignment, we might call this one IT business alignment. Profiting from new opportunities is particularly difficult if you have a complex and difficult to change landscape of complex dependencies. So what needs to be addressed here too was complexity. And all of this has to be managed for the medium and long term of the organization. Now, here's the bad news. Enterprise architecture is a discipline that has been around for 3 decades or so, but we still see the same chaos and lack of alignment everywhere. In other words, enterprise architecture is not a runaway success, even if there are many impressive methods and tools available. So something must be amiss. And this is reflected in the lifespan of enterprise architecture initiatives. They seldom have a very long lifespan. The first 6 years I was at APG, enterprise architecture got reorganized 4 times. That is extreme, but generally the discipline is reorganized a lot. That is not something organizations do when they are very satisfied, is it? Let's have a look at the actual problems enterprise architecture has to solve. What creates that chaos and lack of alignment that enterprise architecture has to prevent? Well, first, choices, such as design choices in projects, are made today that we regret a few years from now. The design decisions today are not in line with the requirements of tomorrow. These are future and unknown requirements. That sounds like an impossible task, right? Note, I am talking about design in general, not just IT design. This is also about the organization, its human roles and processes and so forth. Second, choices are made in different parts of the business IT landscape that are incoherent. These are requirements that are current, luckily, but it is hard to manage them all. And finally, sometimes we just make poor choices. Poor design choices like doing quick and dirty solutions under time pressure in projects and change initiatives. Or sometimes we just make boneheaded choices because we are not all brilliant designers. Good design is hard, and we do not always have the right people doing it. This results in 3 goals for enterprise architecture. We need to make design choices that are a good fit with the organization's future, which, as we know, is for a large part an unknown. Next, we need to make design choices that are coherent with each other, across the organization. And finally, we need high-quality design choices in general. But enterprise architecture has been proven to be rather ineffective to reach those goals. Few people from the enterprise architecture community publicly pay a lot of attention to this. It's an unpopular message. Maybe, however, existing enterprise architecture is really wonderful, and it's all the fault of management. They just won't listen? That is a defense you hear often. But let's be frank, if enterprise architecture worked as advertised, 30 years would have been enough for most organizations to jump on the bandwagon and reap the benefits, right? Because the organizations that did would have succeeded where others did not. 30 years is more than enough for a successful strategy to make it in the evolutionary jungle of our society, its markets and organizations. So we might want to look into the assumption that it is not enterprise architecture that is the problem. Maybe enterprise architecture is the problem, or at least the way we practice it. Let's return to those goals for enterprise architecture and have another look at them. I've highlighted something the goals have in common. What enterprise architecture needs to influence are the choices we make every time we make changes in our organization. You can have an impressive enterprise architecture practice on paper, but if it is unable to influence the choices made, it's rather useless. So what kind of choices are we talking about? We are talking about the everyday choices that are part of a changing organization. Practical choices. The choices that altogether make up our evolving business and IT landscapes. For instance, the practical choice, the business needs reports. where are we going to source these from? Or the practical and real choice when you select an application or platform for a certain task. More often than not, the architecture people are not involved in these selections. It's all about functional and non-functional requirements. By the way, with the exception of something like cost, most are in fact functional requirements, but that is a subject for a later story. Maybe. Interestingly, if you buy an application or platform, what you are also buying is an architecture. My preferred label for these is canned architecture. Most enterprise architecture frameworks seem to be set up from the perspective where you build all your own software, and infrastructure is some sort of dumb commodity to be standardized and nothing more. Ironically, much software is acquired and not built these days, and infrastructure has become a hotbed of innovation, such as software-defined infrastructure. Anyway, buy something and what you get is a part of your architecture that is designed according to someone else's specifications, and where much of it cannot be influenced by your policies at all. But it has become part of your landscape nonetheless, which leads to all kinds of integration issues, leading to many architectural choices that have to be made. Also, the order of changes might be important. And not only how you integrate platforms is important, but also which platforms to integrate in what sort of dependency. So, how is enterprise architecture supposed to do this? Well, there is a sort of standard model for enterprise architecture. First, we have a centralized enterprise architecture function. It must be central, of course, because enterprise architecture is about the entire organization. In the picture, you see I've sketched two change domains. A domain here can be anything: a project, a department, a business unit. There will be many such domains. Now note, here is where the action is. The real choices are made within the so-called domains. And enterprise architecture needs to steer what happens there. It generally does that by sketching a future state architecture for the organization. Often this is combined with some sort of gap analysis to feed program management in terms of what projects we need to do to get from the current state, sometimes called the East architecture, to the desired future state, the ZOL architecture. As, of course, not all details can be managed centrally, what the central enterprise architecture function instead normally provides is architecture or design guidelines and principles. These rules are meant to prevent the chaos that naturally evolves otherwise. Some organizations have gone so far as to let the enterprise architecture function hand out building permits. Nobody can move before enterprise architects give their okay. There are, however, some problems with this standard model. The first problem is that this waterfall approach is fundamentally restricted in two ways. The first is that such a big plan approach does not fit the volatility of the real world all that well. That future state architecture is out of date before the year is done. And though it is customary to say that you need to revisit that future state once a year, something that changes that often and often in some fundamental way cannot provide the stability that makes sure everything is clean and doesn't turn into a chaos. Besides, a very large project or change may easily take 2 to 3 years. Directing such with a future state requires you to describe a future that is 5 to 7 years away. It is impossible to plan so far ahead in a way that is required for enterprise architecture to work. The second problem is that such future state plans are necessarily without much detail. And as we all know, the devil is in the details, so the broad strokes of the future state architecture have little effect on the chaos that naturally evolves from the real choices. What needs to be taken into account is relevant details, and the future state waterfall is not equipped to handle this. Which leads us to the second flaw of the standard approach. Architecture principles are probably the most respected and favored tool in the enterprise architect's toolbox. There is a problem though. The typical problems in a landscape still arise. That is because the principles are almost by definition either too narrow or too broad. I visited an enterprise architecture department of a large bank a few decades ago. They had a shelf with literally 1.5 meters of binders, which contained their architecture, all written down in principles, guidelines, policies, and other rules. They were very proud to show me that, and it was indeed a monumental amount of work. This, we all know today, is largely unworkable. Imagine the poor project architect who has to know all these rules, exceptions, and so forth. Apart from the fact that no project is going to allow a project architect a couple of months first to get acquainted with them, he will run into the situation that for a certain choice, binder A will tell him to do one thing, while binder Z will tell him to do something else. And what should he do? Mostly, these huge reference architectures were ignored by organizations because they are just unusable in a practical sense. Of course, after a while of organizations setting these up, the conferences were filled with speakers explaining that these huge sets were unworkable, and we should limit ourselves to maybe 10 or 20 golden rules. Now, of course, no set of 10 or 20 rules is going to give the answer for all the possible design questions. In fact, let's face it, if just a set of 10 or 20 rules would be enough to prevent chaos to emerge, we would probably be doing that already massively. Architecture principles, by the way, often embody good, wished outcomes. But applying these as design laws is particularly toxic. To explain that, consider this. What actually makes a rule an architecture principle? Well, it is the instruction that comes with the principle. Comply or explain. You know what is funny about comply or explain? It is inherently inconsistent. And this is a bit difficult to explain. The architects that create the principles are of course aware that there are always exceptions. Hence, the option not to follow the rule is introduced, in which case the project architect needs to explain why the rules should not be followed in his or her case. The underlying assumption of this escape is that there are in fact situations where it is better not to follow the rule. But comply or explain says that you have to explain yourself only if you do not follow the rule. So follow the rule and you're by definition okay. And that contradicts the reason for there being an opt-out at all. Because the opt-out says follow the principle and you might not be okay. Now, either it is always a good choice to follow the rule, in which case you do not need exceptions, or you can have exceptions, but in that case it becomes a possibility that following the rule is not such a good idea. And that clashes with the built-in assumption that complying is okay. If all architects would be perfect and working in ideal circumstance, it might work. But not all architects are brilliant. Some will follow the rule because they are poor architects, and they do not recognize that an exception is in order. Or they may be opportunistic. Why go up against the central architecture function if nobody complains if you follow the established rule? There will be pressure from many sides to follow the rule, and you please most stakeholders in the short term if you don't make a fuss. I'm making this point strongly because in my experience, following architecture principles, good outcomes as they often describe, are responsible for many failed large projects. For instance, at some point the Dutch Public Prosecution Office started a large project to create a whole new IT support for the criminal law system. This completely shattered with 150 million euro of taxpayers' money down the drain, and as I could see this from close by, I could see that an important cause was an architecture principle that was followed when it should not have been. These 10 or 20 simple rules are loved by management. It's one of the few products of enterprise architecture that they actually like. They like it because it denies the underlying complexity and it presents them with an attractive make-believe world of managed simplicity. More about that later. I'm going to throw in a bit of depth. And the reason I'm doing this is because we in architecture can profit from learning something about the limits of rules and logic, which are and will remain our favorite tools and also the foundation of the IT we have to deal with. What these principles and guidelines do is run afoul of an important insight we can take from philosophy. The insight comes from one of the most important philosophers in history, Ludwig Wittgenstein, who, by the way, originally was trained as an engineer, which might explain in part his focus on use. As explained by Peter Hacker, Wittgenstein has stated that the meaning of something lies hidden in its correct use. That huge set of binders was in practice not usable, and it was thus meaningless. The small set proved unusable as well, so it is meaningless too. I use this dictum all the time in my professional life as an architect. If someone drops a big document on my desk and after reading I cannot imagine how this document is to be effectively used, I know it is meaningless, and I can safely drop it in the cylindrical archive. The meaning of what we produce as architects must lie in how it has to be used. Incidentally, I use the same reasoning to decide on modeling patterns in the Archimate enterprise architecture language. Let's move to the third flaw. Here you are, with your central enterprise architecture function. It has to review change designs from across the entire organization. But it cannot cover all the relevant details. It can't know enough to match the level of knowledge that is in the domain itself. So what happens? Well, it may become some sort of low-quality bottleneck. For instance, by just checking if a design fits with the guidelines and principles, but not really understanding it. Or by only looking at high-level grand vistas and not contributing to the quality of the real choices. Or it has to rely on the other domains. For instance, it passes stuff on to the other domains and just passes review from others through. There is a commonly applied solution for this flaw. That is to turn the central enterprise architecture function into a sort of design office. In this model, all the architects and/or designers of the various domains in the organization are part of a single office, and they create all the solution designs for every project in the organization. This is, however, partly an illusion, because it is impossible to get all design decisions in that office. Some of these, especially with respect to how the business is run, will remain in the domains. The design office alternative solves two problems. One, it is much more powerful to collaborate in person than it is to get synchronized and directed behavior through faraway vistas, principles and guidelines. And the design office alternative also solves part of the knowledge transfer problems. But the model also introduces a few problems of its own. First among these is the problem that the owner of the project or change is never the design office itself. So as far as the design is concerned, there are two captains on each ship. One is the project owner or executive, the other is the lead architect. And as always, this only matters when people disagree. Aside, many governance models are created with the idea of an agreement in mind. But structures like these are above all important to solve differences of opinion. For instance, from the organization-wide perspective of enterprise architecture, it might be best to create a solution that is more work and more risk for the project, but leads to a better, less risky landscape for the organization. The project owner, however, has limited resources and above all a limited scope. That extra effort is not needed for his or her scope, and project management methodologies will see to it that such extras are kept out of scope as much as possible. In a situation like that, the poor architect of the project can only do it wrong. Either he or she proposes a solution that makes the project owner happy, but his boss from enterprise architecture will be dissatisfied with him or her because he or she does not protect architectural drivers well enough. Or the architect chooses to keep his or her boss satisfied, but the project owner will be very disappointed about the lack of client focus of the architect. There is another nasty side effect. In this model, the domains do not feel any responsibility for the design choices, the trade-offs required, the long-term effects, and so forth. They can just lean back, not feel responsible for the effect of their choices on the rest of the organization, and concentrate on their functional requirements. Where the first standard model leads to mostly ignoring architecture, this model leads automatically to a lot of conflicts. The conflicts in this model are less healthy though than the ones from my practice, which I'll be presenting later. So, summarizing. The waterfall from current state via addressing gaps in the portfolio to a future state doesn't really work well. The central enterprise architecture function must be central to work but lacks relevant domain know-how to function properly. And rules such as architecture principles have a limited beneficial effect and they can even be toxic. Which brings us to the core of this presentation. What can we in enterprise architecture learn from chess? Suppose we look at our business IT landscape as a sort of chessboard, where every change, such as a project, changes the complex landscape. We take the idea of a chess move as the analogy for that change. Chess has a couple of properties, such as complexity and unpredictability, that echo those of enterprise architecture. We can use some of the aspects of chess and apply these to enterprise architecture. To start with, if you make a move in a chess game, the long-term effects of that move are in fact not predictable. A move does not lead to a specific end state. It's not that a chess player thinks, I'm going to work towards a situation where his king is there, his pawn is there, my queen is there, my king is there, and my bishop is there, and it will be checkmate. Chess players are not very busy with exact future states. They are not even very busy with vague or abstract descriptions of the end position. They are, above all, very busy with improving their current position, with managing risks and opportunities. Many enterprise architects, however, are sold on the idea that you need to define a future state. Some will say architected enterprise, a state that you want to develop towards. This is something most orthodox enterprise architecture frameworks contain in their basis. I think we must let much of that idea behind us. We need to change fundamentally how we look at architectural or design decisions. We need, as a chess player does, think about improving the current state, not about working towards a dreamed up abstract future state. The situation is somewhat more complex than that. There is a place for thinking about the faraway future, both in chess and in enterprise architecture. And I will get back to that later. Next. Strategic rules in chess are descriptive, not prescriptive. This is one I have to explain in depth. Let me start with a small anecdote. When my son had learned the basics of chess, he asked me, Dad, I know the rules of chess now, and which moves are allowed and which moves are not. But when is a move a good move? And I answered, well, that is what makes the game so interesting. It is not very simple, but I can give you a few starting rules you can apply, such as this one. Suppose you take someone's piece, they take one back from you. Maybe this happens in a series. You can give each piece a numbered value. Say queen is 9, rook or castle is 5, bishop and knight are 3 and a pawn is 1. If, at the end of the exchange, you have received more points than you have given away, it has been a profitable move. And I gave him a few more rules like that. Such a rule is not a rule of the game. The game rules set the stage on which we play. We might compare these to the real-world boundaries of enterprise architecture, such as the fact that you cannot send a cup of coffee through an Ethernet cable. But the rules we may use to decide on which legal move to make are more tactical or strategic rules. Now we can make an interesting observation in chess. Suppose we take 10 of such tactical rules. Does following these rules win you the game? Is a chess grandmaster following a limited set of such rules when he plays the game? And the answer is no, and the early chess programs have amply proven that. Following tactical rules does not win you the game. It's just not that simple. Going for material advantage all the time doesn't win you the game. But if you look at games after they have been played, you will see that at the end, the winner in almost all cases has more pieces than the loser. In other words, the rule for material advantage describes an aspect of the outcome of winning a game very well. It's just not something that you will reach when you follow the rule. The strategic rule is thus not prescriptive, it is only descriptive. Now, the same is true for enterprise architecture. Architecture principles and guidelines generally describe a desired outcome very well. They are not wrong, but trying to do enterprise architecture by following rules and steering with them doesn't work. I generally see these guidelines as patterns that will emerge from good design. They're not foundational, but emergent, and only if you do it well. Steering with principles, by the way, is what most orthodox enterprise architecture frameworks propose. They sometimes even start with defining the architecture principles. And that, in my opinion, is a fundamental flaw. Next. Let's talk about details. In chess, as in enterprise architecture, it is impossible to pay attention to all the details all the time. But if you play the game, you will experience that small details may make or break you. The difference between winning and losing might be one pawn that should have been one square further ahead. In chess, you can't pay attention to all the details. What you need to learn is to recognize which details are relevant. In orthodox enterprise architecture, it is customary to warn against going into too much detail. Don't get lost in details. We need to stay at high level. Watch out for analysis paralysis. We are architects, the details are for the designers, and there is a clear difference between the two. And so forth. And the result is that details are being ignored, which in the end always trips us up. It is like that saying attributed to Confucius: people do not stumble over mountains, they stumble over molehills. I have a different approach to abstraction than just leaving out details below some level. Around 1994, I was working for Shell as a contractor. Everybody who worked at the site had to complete a safety course. So I and other new employees and temps sat in this classroom, and an older, wizened guy stood before us and asked us, "So people, what do you think is working safely?" Well, one of us responded, "That means you should not take risks." Wrong, he said. Working safely is consciously taking acceptable risk. There is no such thing as not taking risks. And if you think you are not taking risks, you're actually taking risks you're not aware of. This was a very important lesson, and more widely applicable than just in safety situations. It is a core of security in any situation, for instance cybersecurity. But it has also led me to formulate a different approach to using abstraction in architecture. Abstraction remains important for us architects. Without it, we drown in details of a massively complex world. But just ignoring details is not the answer. So my definition of abstraction in architecture is: abstraction is consciously leaving out irrelevant detail. Of course, the issue then becomes, how do top chess players find the relevant details? Well, interestingly, it turns out that top chess players do not calculate more than good amateurs. Garry Kasparov once said that on average he thinks about 3 moves ahead. Already in 1946, the thought processes of chess players were investigated by Adriaan de Groot. And he found out that the difference between good amateurs and top chess players was that the top chess players were much better at spotting the potentially good moves before they calculated the actual effect of such a move. Their calculation skills were equal, but where good amateur often missed a potential good move, the top chess player never missed it. They had superior pattern recognition skills, a superior estimation. If you take that to the world of enterprise architecture, we don't need architects that are better at frameworks and producing architecture artifacts. We need architects that have a superior estimation in a complex world. Suppose, however, that you want to beat a human at chess using rules. It has been done, after all. A computer is a massive rule engine. In whatever disguise the programming has been created. And IBM's deep thought did beat Garry Kasparov in the 90s. But what was needed was a machine that had millions of rules, certainly not the 10 or 20 as proposed for enterprise architecture, a machine that calculates 200 positions per second. Remember, Garry Kasparov only looked at a few positions each move. And in the case of deep thought, you need a bit of cheating, as the IBM team also contained an international grandmaster chess who influenced the computer during the match. Still, computers can now outcalculate the estimation capabilities of humans in chess, though it is probably fundamentally not possible to get human-level intelligence with digital computers, Watson notwithstanding. But that is another subject. Anyway, we've seen that in the complexity of chess, the basic elements that are part of the orthodox enterprise architecture approach don't work. Is that all? No, there is bad news, namely that chess is in fact extremely simple compared to enterprise architecture. In the real world of organizations, the situation is much more difficult than in a game of chess. For one, in chess you can completely know all the details of your position. It is after all just a small board of just 64 fields and a maximum of 32 pieces of just 6 different types. But in enterprise architecture, it is impossible to know all the details of the board you are playing on. The squares overlap and the board is of an immense and changing size with all kinds of different pieces with different behavior. Secondly, while you are making a move on the enterprise architecture board, other parts of the board change as well. There are a multitude of players, all playing simultaneously on that same board, and they are not taking turns nicely. And if that is not enough, the goals of the organization are not as simple as in chess, where it's just checkmate. They are complex, contradictory, and they change during the game. So the question becomes, why do people believe in simplistic mechanisms, such as principles, guidelines, abstractions that ignore all details, and so forth? It doesn't work for something as simple as chess. How can people think that it works in the infinitely more complex and unpredictable world of enterprise architecture? And the answer is because it is seductive. We enterprise architects and others, we know that we cannot have a full design, that we cannot take all details into account, and that the future is uncertain. We are overwhelmed by the complexity of it all. We are acutely aware that what needs to be done can't be done at all. So what we have done is that we have fallen back on what we think is doable. This is reminiscent of the story of the cop and the drunk. The cop encounters a drunk man on the street who is uncertainly walking around under a street lamp, looking at the ground. And the cop asks him, "Sir, can I help you? What are you doing in the middle of the street?" And the man answers, "Well, I've lost my house keys." And the cop asks, "Have you lost them here?" "No," says the man, "I've lost them back there." "So why are you looking here instead of there?" the cop asks. "Well," said the man, "here is the light." Orthodox enterprise architecture is a bit like that drunk man. Being overwhelmed is not a nice state of mind. It creates stress in a human. One could say that the standard approach to enterprise architecture, the one that tries to ignore details and works with simple, doable, but ineffective approaches, is like a biological flight reaction. Instead of fighting complexity and unpredictability, orthodox enterprise architecture has fled into a make-believe world of simple mechanisms and simplified abstractions. What we need is that we need to fight complexity, not flee from complexity into oversimplifications. There is a nice quote about complexity that you probably have heard before, and that goes like this. "In every field of inquiry, it is true that all things should be made as simple as possible, but no simpler." Most attribute it to Albert Einstein, but the quote is in fact from a journalist and essayist, Sidney Harris. And the second part of the quote is never added, but it is essential. And it says, "And for every problem that is muddled by overcomplexity, a dozen are muddled by oversimplifying." I personally have seen more disasters like projects that fail, that take twice as long, that deliver half the intended results or none at all, at 4 times the cost, as a result from oversimplification than as the result from anything else. Here is an important fact that is related to this. Every landscape, if you abstract it enough, becomes a picture that is simple, elegant and clean. And this is of course also true for your current complicated reality. What we tend to do as architects is to present to management a simple, elegant and clean abstraction of the future. And we present them a small set of rules to follow so we get there. Now management knows the current reality is complicated, brittle, messy and so forth. And you present them with a clean, simple, abstract future and clear path towards it. That simple future will be more flexible, easier to maintain and cheaper. So what do you think they will say? They will take that nice, elegant future over the current mess any day in the week. Yes, please, I'd like that one, not my current complex and unmanageable reality. But you can make the same clean, abstract and elegant picture of your current mess. Experience has taught me that simplified grand designs are dangerous. We just love simplified grand designs. They paint a future of heaven on earth. But sketching a heaven on earth doesn't create a heaven on earth. On the contrary, ignoring the messy and complex reality comes at a nasty price. That is true in many cases, and it is true for enterprise architecture as well. Which brings us to the popular enterprise architecture boardroom game. Step 1. An organization starts or restarts an enterprise architecture initiative. The architects create a future state and principles and guidelines, and this is presented to the board. The board likes what they see. A world freed from messy, complicated dependencies. A simple world where they can rely on, and which looks manageable, which is of course an important aspect for management. Step 2 is a while later. The board becomes dissatisfied with a lack of progress. Generally, this takes 1 to 3 years. And step 3 is where the board decides that it has to do something. It reorganizes, changes the architecture function, and then returns to square one. Note that many managers have experienced this now so often that they have lost all belief in enterprise architecture. Getting that fixed will be very difficult, especially because there is a very nasty catch-22 for the enterprise architects. In case you haven't heard the term, a catch-22 is a situation where a required action contradicts the requirements for the action. The original catch-22 comes from a brilliantly funny novel of that name by Joseph Heller, which plays during World War II. In the novel, if you want to get discharged because you cannot stand it anymore because war has made you crazy, you need to fill out a form. However, being able to fill out the form counts as proof that you're not crazy enough to get discharged. Enterprise architects experience the same in a way. Management requires that you are able to explain the complexities in a simple way. But every time you create a simple explanation, you send the hidden message that the situation is not complex at all. All those nice simple diagrams and simple sets of rules send the message that the whole issue is not that difficult. But it is. So when the simple approaches fail, the logical conclusion is that those who are responsible for the results are morons. They can't even do a simple thing right. I'm largely going to skip this slide. The presentation is long enough as it is, and I'm leaving it in for you to read. You can pause the presentation for this. The takeaway from this slide is that there is no proper evidence for the effectiveness of any of the enterprise architecture frameworks that are available. Enterprise architecture shares this with many other disciplines, not the least of which is management, by the way. Most management theories, even famous ones, are not proven to work. It seems that our discipline, though on one hand deeply embedded in science and technology, is more an art than a science. So let's talk about how you can perform that art. There are two basic requirements for effective enterprise architecture. The first requirement is that whatever you do in enterprise architecture, it must have an effect where the solutions are created and the design decisions are being made. If that is not the case, then everything you do is pretty pointless. The second requirement is based on the assumption that it is impossible for anyone or any department to know enough to make the right decisions. Not even the best architects can have that much knowledge. The complexity and scale of the subject thus requires collaboration between all those that have relevant knowledge. Here you see the way I have been setting up enterprise architecture. Instead of an enterprise architecture function that sits above everybody steering design work, or that sits between those that are doing design work, it largely sits below everyone supporting design work. It supports a cooperative design process. That doesn't mean there is no power in the enterprise architecture function. There needs to be, and I'll get to that shortly. A central role in this setup is reserved for the architecture board. Here the various domains are represented, and here the real architectural discussions about the options take place. There is still some top-down approach in enterprise architecture. I'll get to that shortly. First, we look at the second important building block, the checks and balances. Here I've modeled a basic organization. There is a board of directors, each having some sort of mandate. For instance, there is the domain of the CFO, the Chief Financial Officer, and the domain of the Chief Operating Officer or COO, and the CCO, the Chief Client Officer. Now, suppose within the domain of the COO there is a project. The COO is the sponsor of this project and a project executive has been appointed. The key to enterprise architecture is to recognize that enterprise architecture is about the balance between the now and the future, and between the limited scope and the overall situation. Projects are about limited scope and limited time. Architecture is about the longer term and the wider scope. You cannot let one rule the other. Enterprise architecture is about balance. To create that balance, we need to make sure the different sides are both properly represented in the processes that create the design decisions. It is important for an organization to recognize that next to the individual mandates, there is a subject of the overall landscape. This responsibility is part of the responsibilities of the board of directors. This overall landscape must be felt as an important responsibility that is shared by all. A separate officer, such as a Chief Information Officer or CIO, cannot really be independently responsible for the all. The only one director who might potentially fulfill this role is the CEO, but it's best seen as a collective responsibility because it interferes with all mandates of all board members. But just as the COO only sponsors the project, it is enough that the board of directors sponsors the other side of the balance, architecture. A lead architect can be accountable for the architecture of the organization on behalf of the board, a bit like the chief legal counsel that some organizations need. By the way, the A's in the picture stand for accountable. A project executive is accountable for a project. This also means that the project executive is accountable for the architecture of the project, even if the person creating it is some sort of project architect, maybe even on loan from the enterprise architecture function. So how do we make sure that the project's designs are good from an overall landscape perspective and from a longer-term perspective? The stakeholder for that is the lead architect, also sponsored by the board. The board, in fact, has to translate both mandates into two stakeholders that have to work together from two perspectives. The way this works is that it is the project's responsibility to create designs for their project. And it's the responsibility of the enterprise architecture to guide and review these. In a happy flow, everybody agrees. But you have this mechanism not for the case that projects by themselves do the things enterprise architecture agrees with. You have this mechanism to manage the inevitable conflicts between both sides. Note, conflict sounds a bit harsh. Often it's a matter of different insights and different estimates. In case there is a conflict that both sides cannot agree on a way to resolve it, the lead architect withholds his approval of the design. And that means that issue must be escalated to the board. Suppose the project cannot agree to the wishes of enterprise architecture because they have neither the time nor the resources to do so. If that is the case, the board effectively owns conflicting requirements. They want that good architecture and limited project risks, but they also want the change for a price or within a time frame that makes good architecture or a low-risk approach impossible. So they have to choose. And let me repeat that, they have to choose. And if the choice is against the lead architect, that is not a big deal. Life goes on, as long as the choice is made consciously. This is how it should be. It is silly to expect that you can always make the best choices from a single, that is your own, perspective. Of course, if this mode of operation matures over time, you'll see less and less conflicts as people start to work together to prevent these conflicts. A good lead architect already tries to foster such collaboration and uses his architecture board for that. You need a lot of we thinking, and you need to make sure discussions are respectful and of high quality. The book contains much more details about this process, which is both collaborative but also with clear responsibilities. I'm skipping this slide. Most has been said already, and I'm leaving it in for reference. So, what about architecture principles? Well, they can be very useful, but it is best not to build your architecture processes around them. What you need is good design decisions, and rules are not going to get you these. They might even prevent necessary discussion and lead you astray. We've already talked about the dangers of comply or explain. Often people want the principles because turning choices into the laws of the Medes and the Persians is their only way to influence the flow of design choices. Stressing the use of architecture principles is often a sign of low status within the organization. It's a way to make sure people have to listen. It is, however, a very poor alternative to actually collaborating. I've also seen principles be used as weapons in a very politicized environment. One IT manager once told me being the lead architect, that he expected me to make laws so he did not have to discuss his choices all the time with the business. It was of course a given that these laws reflected the choices he wanted. He saw the rest of the organization as an enemy of sorts that had to be forced into the direction he wanted. Doing architecture as if you were playing a game of chess means you have to live your life forwards, not backwards. Orthodox enterprise architecture often works from the idea that you first define a desired future state and then you work towards it. This makes enterprise architecture a sort of super waterfall project, and frankly, that needs magic to work. Incidentally, it's not totally wrong to see the chess approach as a form of agile enterprise architecture. Enterprise chess means you have to pay attention to three things. The current position on the board, or the current state architecture. The move you're making, or the project architecture. And the future, and I'm getting back to that later. You need to pay attention to your current landscape. Many organizations think this is an impossible waste of time, especially to keep this up to date. But in my experience, it isn't. It's not easy, that's true. Nothing in enterprise architecture ever is, isn't it? But it's doable. And it sure beats a total lack of insight. For example, you might model your landscape in Archimate and BPMN. Such a model can support analysis and reporting, and one effect is an increase in reliability and efficiency of your design processes. Every large change, every project needs its own architecture. This is a description of the situation after the project has been completed and any intermediate stage or plateau that goes live. You do not need to describe all the details. You describe only the relevant details. That is, you might leave out all the details based on a risk assessment. Does leaving out the details pose a risk for the success of the project itself? Or does leaving the details out pose a risk for the landscape as a whole? There is, as far as I'm concerned, not a definitive detail level that separates architecture from the rest. I've seen good project architectures where in one part everything was left out and the message was, Users and engineers figure it out together. There is nothing you can really do wrong here. And in the same project architecture, there was a statement that certain data needed to be stored in XML type objects in an Oracle database because there was a scenario where that mattered enormously. And we'll get to scenarios later. A project architecture should contain a partly detailed model of the end state and plateaus of a project. When the project finishes, the project needs to have filled in all the details and the model becomes part of the current state architecture. Which brings us to the final subject of this presentation, managing the future. And the first question is, of course, if the future state is unpredictable, as it is in chess, what use is a future state? And the answer is, instead of creating a design for the future, you can create requirements for later design decisions. And this differs from making those design decisions for the future now. In orthodox enterprise architecture, it is customary to respond to the unpredictability by leaving out details and making ever more abstract designs, but designs nonetheless. But instead of us abstracting away from details, we can also move away from designs when talking about the future. There are, in my practice, 4 major elements of a future state document for me. The first is that the future should fit with the strategic goals of the organization. So the future state document contains the requirements that follow from those strategic goals. The third element has to do with architectural or design quality, things that have to do with the essential quality of the landscape. Here you might find guidelines for design, but not principles. The guidelines are nothing more than the requirements that have to be weighed against all other requirements. They come from the overall landscape goals, but they are part of the checks and balances. They are not the requirements that can steer everything. The fourth element has to do with the idea of achievability. This I can best illustrate with a small story. At some point in an organization I know, the top management considered the fact that the 2 different business units each used a different enterprise service bus. Say, one had TIBCO and the other had Oracle. From the idea that the rationalization would be beneficial, they asked the lead architects of the business units if it would be possible to replace their existing service bus with another. The lead architect of one of the business units reacted as follows. Listen, we have a patient here that has AIDS, a brain tumor, a broken leg, and a few more problems. He was, of course, talking about his business unit and everything that was bad about its landscape. We're actually busy with this patient to replace his eyes, in other words, the data warehouse. We're rebuilding his fingers, in other words, implementing a new major trading system. And we have plans to replace his guts soon, as they are dying. In other words, our accounting system is beyond its end of life already. And you come and ask me if it is possible to do a heart transplant, the service bus. I can tell you that even if the transplant succeeds, it is very unlikely the patient will survive. I think that with all the things we have already planned and which we cannot turn away from, it is pretty certain that we'll need to keep the current service bus working for many years to come. So my advice would be to try to cut the best deal you can with our ESB vendor for a long-term contract with only potential decreases in cost. And I'll see you again in 5 years to see where we stand. In other words, don't waste time thinking about a possible renewal of the service bus in the upcoming years. It's not achievable given the rest of what you have planned. Removing the ESB from the endless list of potential things to change makes making choices a lot easier. It is really efficient if we do not only think about what we will do, but also are explicit about what we will not do. You probably have noted that I have skipped the second element. It is the most important element of all. Suppose we are an asset manager of a pension fund. Note, this story is hypothetical, not something that really happened at one of the organizations I have worked for. Now, our clients are pension funds. We manage their assets, but more than that. We actually are a fiduciary manager, which means we manage assets and liabilities. We support strategy processes. We are in fact somewhat the outsourced chief investment officer. So we have 2 sorts of reports to create. We have to create fund reports about the assets for ourselves and our regulators, but also client reports for the client pension funds and their regulators. We have an accounting system where all our assets are accounted for. And we have a data warehouse where a copy of a lot of the information from accounting, trading and more is stored. Currently, the investment risk calculations are sourced from the data warehouse, because the outdated accounting system cannot hold several new asset classes properly, and the details are thus kept in the data warehouse, sourced from yet another system. The data warehouse is currently the only place where we have all the necessary data to feed the financial risk management system. Also, other reports are created there. Now, this older accounting system is going to be replaced. So we go look for a new one. It should be able to hold all the asset classes we need. Which ones are they? Well, since the financial crisis, we have a new strategy, simple and stable. Part of the strategy is that we will not invest in all kinds of weird assets. For instance, we will not invest in derivatives of derivatives. So swaptions, which are options on swaps, are out. And we will not invest in fringe products like mortality rate swaps, though these could in fact be handy for a pension fund investor. So we go out and we buy ourselves a shiny new accounting system. As they are not needed in our strategy, we do not require swaptions or mortality rate swaps. After all, what's the use of a strategy if it doesn't play a role in system purchases? Now the question arises, will we still be creating reports from the data warehouse and feed the risk system from it? All the data will now be available from the accounting system. Why have an extra step with all the risks that entails? We might, for instance, end up with slightly different numbers from both systems. Always a problem. Maybe IT performance issues are also important. So, as sourcing directly from the accounting system makes our landscape simpler, and we subscribe to the broadly supported architectural wisdom that simplification makes our landscape better, we decide to source risk and reporting from the new accounting system. So it is implemented and everything is well. And then, a year later, the following happens. The regulator of our clients, pension funds, decides that pension funds have to spread their assets over multiple asset managers to make them less dependent on a single point of failure. So suddenly, a third of our assets will move away to other asset managers, required by law. That is a big drop in income, however not a big problem, because we can of course also acquire the assets that other fiduciary managers have to give up. So our biggest customer moves a third of his assets to, say, BlackRock. But remember, we are not just an asset manager, we are a fiduciary manager, right? So we still have to make the client reports for the pension fund, do the risk calculations for the pension fund, etc. In other words, we need the data from BlackRock to do that. And the pension funds knows it, so they have a contract that tells BlackRock to deliver a daily dump of their positions to us. We will add these to our accounting system and everything will work again, right? One day, the first dump arrives. And what is in there? Swaptions, mortality rate swaps. But these don't fit in our accounting system. So now we have to load the outside data in the more flexible data warehouse for client management, reporting, etc. And either we have now effectively two reporting environments, or we need to migrate our fund reporting also to the data warehouse. Could we have known this in advance? And the answer is surprisingly often yes, because such changes in regulatory policy are often discussed years in advance. And even if they are not discussed yet, we can imagine they can come. We can look explicitly for uncertainties in our assumptions. One such an uncertainty would be surrounding the statement, "We are the only asset manager of our pension fund clients." If that statement is decided to be uncertain, and that uncertainty is large, and its effect is large too, it is an important uncertainty. This, by the way, is the core idea behind a strategy methodology called scenario planning, and it's the best way to manage uncertainties. If we had identified this uncertainty beforehand, the discussion about where to source the reports from, or the financial risk system from, would have been different. We would have said, yes, currently the choice to source this directly from accounting is best. But this particular uncertainty makes that choice brittle, and so it is more robust to still make that extra step towards the data warehouse and source reporting and risk from there. In other words, our most important requirement is robustness under uncertainty. A very important, if not the most important part of a future state document, therefore, contains a list of uncertainties that architects and designers in projects have to take into account. This part of the future state document would tell architects and designers you are not allowed to assume we are the only asset manager of a client, even if this is currently the case and if there are no plans to change that. Okay, lastly, an important aspect of architectural work is the idea of a plateau. At all times in the overall landscape or in projects, we can work with explicit plateaus. A plateau is a state of our landscape. Every time we change our production landscape, we get a new overall landscape. And there is a single question to answer for every plateau. Will the organization still function? If a project delivers in 2 phases, that is fine. But for both phases, we need to know if the organization still works, if the overall landscape is still sound. We are going to have a short summary. Enterprise architecture is about the entire enterprise in a few years' time. The future of the enterprise is unpredictable. The current situation of the enterprise is not perfectly knowable and extremely volatile, with a multitude of actors acting concurrently. So enterprise architecture is like the chess game from hell, and probably one of the most complex endeavors in the world, which is partly why it fails so often. Enterprise architecture must have effect on the actual design decisions, or it is meaningless. Architecture principles carry significant risks, especially comply or explain, and have little effect on the real problems. And neither have simplified grand designs. Oversimplification is far more dangerous than too much detail. Nobody can know everything. Only cooperation by knowledgeable people works. Checks and balances on actual choices, that is, design decisions, are essential to prevent dangerous tunnel vision and to get a minimum quality. The most important aspect of a future state architecture is robustness under uncertainty. I had a discussion once with a board member. I asked her, do you want the IT people to nail, glue and otherwise bind you to your current strategy? Of course not, she replied. Well, I told her, in that case, you should tell them which elements may be uncertain in the long term, because they will glue, nail and screw you to your current strategy if you don't. If I tell them, they rightfully say to me, who are you that you dare to doubt the board's strategy? So you need to step in. There's an ironic twist if you consider that most frameworks tell you to base architecture on the organization's strategy. That is because the average lifespan of a company strategy is maybe 4 years. And the average lifespan of a large IT element in your landscape is around 15. I've seen strategy turns of 180 degrees on fundamental aspects, which makes it rather risky to base your architectural decisions on strategy, don't you think? That architecture you design has to survive on average 4 yet unknown changes of strategy direction. Hence, one of the key uncertainties is the enterprise strategy itself. And thus, awareness at board level of the complexity problem and fight versus flight and the uncertainty problem is essential, or enterprise architecture will most likely fail. And don't forget the enterprise architect's catch-22 I mentioned earlier. In my experience, the best enterprise architects have an engineering background. They have lived deep in the world of complex dependencies and they have experienced the limits of IT. But also some of the worst come from there. That is, if they haven't learned the limits of their logical and predictable world and are like the quantitative analysts that created the financial crisis of 2008. Some of whom complained that the reality was wrong, not their models. And that brings us, as far as I'm concerned, to a new beginning. I'm convinced that we can do better than we have done in the last 30 years or so. But I'm also convinced that to do better, we must shake ourselves free from several deep-felt assumptions of current enterprise architecture practices. You can read the entire argument and analysis and the setup of a different practice in the book Chess and the Art of Enterprise Architecture, which is accompanied by a blog of the same name about enterprise architecture. The book, by the way, is a lot richer than this presentation. For instance, it also contains a fully documented template for a project start architecture based on what we were using in practice. And it contains a description and analysis of the hurdles I ran into when I was trying to implement the approach. You can see on the sheet all the data you need. And that was it. Thank you very much.